Sony Computer Entertainment goes full bore into the development of the PlayStation, it becomes clear that this will be a console unlike any other.
The biggest feature of PlayStation was going to be the real-time 3D graphics technology.
At the time, the PlayStation was a faster console than anything out in the market. It could push more polygons. It gave developers a larger toolbox to work with than any of the competing consoles. And of course, it used CD-ROMs.
After watching the failure of systems like the 3DO very closely, Sony realizes that processing power alone isn't enough to come out on top in the world of video games.
We looked at the business models of all of the companies that have been in the space or tried to get into space, and we asked ourselves, could we do this better?
The biggest problem that we had was that the market in 1993 was dominated by Sega and Nintendo. They pretty much had it sewn up between them. So any new entrant into the market had to do something pretty dramatic and pretty special.
Sure, we had the system, sure, we had the hardware, but it doesn't mean anything unless you have games. Nintendo already had Miyamoto, and he was a genius. Sega, they already had their arcade games, but Sony, what do they have? They don't have a genius developer or arcade games they're making, so they had to find software somewhere.
We knew that in order to be successful, we had to capture the hearts and minds of the developers and the publishers equally.
So what they did was they went on a very aggressive campaign to all the developers to...
If Sony had not brought hardware to the video game industry, I think the industry would be a lot smaller than it is right now.
Enough to really differentiate this system and show that it was a 3D-based system, and it really blew everybody away.
But at first, a lot of developers were dead set against it, mainly because it was high technology, it was 3D, and a lot of game companies were still making 2D games, and they said that's going to be so expensive to make 3D games, no way we can afford it, and it's going to be very hard.
Fight one! Ready? Go!
One game that changed it and helped Sony, ironically, was Virtua Fighter.
Sega announced Virtua Fighter for the first time, and that completely opened up eyes of other publishers that showed that 3D graphics can be applied to other types of games.
All of a sudden, there was a leap. I couldn't keep up with enough of the companies that were coming to us. They were asking us, can we do this? Is it possible to do this? Everybody wanted to work on the system.
Sony does everything it can to round up third-party developers to support the PlayStation and is able to sign 250 in Japan alone.
The first task for me was managing the third-party departments to recruit and help support third parties like Namco. My target was to get as many publishers and many popular title franchises to become available on PlayStation.
Sony also spends $48 million to purchase Psygnosis, the European developer behind Lemmings, and changes its name to Sony Interactive Entertainment. In December of 1994, Sony releases the PlayStation, now without an X, in Japan.
The success in Japan was almost instantaneous. Another 3 months to get to the million mark in Japan. And I remember the then chairman of Nintendo saying that if we ever got to 1 million units, he would resign because he clearly knew nothing about the games business. It took him a few more years to actually get around to it, but I thought it was a great statement.
The next step is ensuring a successful launch in the US and Europe. To pull this off, Sony spares no expense. The Japanese giant spends a rumored $4 million for a booth at E3 in 1995. Sony also kicks off a huge marketing blitz to raise awareness for the PlayStation.
The marketing strategy was very clearly defined from the beginning that we needed to appeal to an older, more sophisticated audience. We also had a very smart bunch of people in our marketing department who recognized that everybody really wants to be 19. If you're 12, you want to be 19. If you're 25, you really want to be 19 again. And so what they did was they targeted 19 as the communication tone of voice.
Another thing that I think was really key to establishing that credibility for us was the idea that gamers wanted to work a bit harder at deciphering messages, you know, teasing a date like 9995, playing with Enos, which was essentially Sony spelled backwards.
Sony was saying games are a lifestyle, and we're going to promote and work it from a lifestyle perspective.
We very deliberately stayed away from making SONY, the Sony brand, a big part of the communications message. The initial tagline of "You are not ready" was the first big step that we took in saying, this is not your parents' Sony brand.
With this new mindset, Sony sets out to conquer the United States.